Okay, well, it is 5:30. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Megan Rust, Interpretation Director at the Frist Art Museum. Thank you for joining us for today's program with Kristin Spangenberg. We will begin with a land acknowledgement. The Frist Art Museum's building sits on land that Cherokee and Shawnee Native peoples and elders call their homeland. We acknowledge and pay respect to them. We also acknowledge and offer deep gratitude to the ancestral land and water that support us. This evening's lecture is presented in conjunction with the exhibition Albrecht Dürer, The Age of Reformation and Renaissance. The exhibition is organized by the Cincinnati Art Museum and will be on view in the Frist upper level galleries through February 7, 2021. The Frist Art Museum would like to thank Curator Trinita Kennedy for overseeing our presentation of this exhibition, and we gratefully acknowledge our supporting sponsors for the exhibition, the Ann and Joe Russell family. And as always, we are grateful for the continuing operating support from the Metro Nashville Arts Commission, the Tennessee Arts Commission, and the National Endowment for the Arts. Before we begin, I'd like to share a few reminders. At the end of the conversation, we'll take questions from the audience. Please submit your questions anytime throughout the presentation using the Q&A feature. And thank you in advance for your patience with us as we present this program online. In the event of a technical difficulty, we'll pause the presentation and we'll work quickly to resolve the issue. If you're having difficulties on your personal device, feel free to send a chat message to Frist IT. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Kristin Spangenberg. Kristin Spangenberg serves as Curator of Prints at the Cincinnati Art Museum. She earned her bachelor's degree from the University of California at Davis and a master's degree from the University of Michigan. She is a member of the Print Council of America, the American Historical Print Collectors Society, and the Circus Historical Society, and has lectured on many topics, including Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec, Pablo Picasso, and Frank Duveneck. She has written catalogs for many of the Cincinnati Art Museum's exhibitions on prints, drawings, and photographs. Her essay, Frank Duveneck and the Etching Revival, will be published this year in conjunction with the exhibition Frank Duveneck, American Master. Please join me in welcoming Kristin Spangenberg.
Good evening. It's my pleasure to share with you information regarding Albrecht Dürer, the Age of Reformation and Renaissance. The German artist Albrecht Dürer was a painter, draftsman, printmaker, and book illustrator, humanicist and theoretician on proportion, perspective, and fortifications. His art and writings exerted a formative influence on the establishment of Renaissance art in Northern Europe on the eve of the Reformation. He was a savvy businessman with a sophisticated distribution network. Durr produced prints in a variety of techniques and themes that accommodated a wide range of customer tastes and budgets. Durr was born May 21st, 1471 in Nuremberg, one of the largest and most prosperous cities in Europe. His early training was with his father, who was a goldsmith, and laid the technical background for his graphic production that would spread his fame across the continent. He raised the graphic arts to a new level of artistic brilliance. His technical innovations brought the woodcut to maturity in his publications, The Apocalypse and the Life of the Virgin. The sophistication and subtlety of his engravings reflect his skill and his engagement with Renaissance humanicisms and intellectual movement that imitated the classical culture of ancient Greece and Rome. A devout Christian, Durr was sympathetic to religious reform movements of his time. He showed interest in the ideas of Martin Luther, whose 95 theses posted in 1517 challenged the Roman Catholic Church's indulgences and triggered enormous theological, political, and cultural changes throughout Europe. In his final years with the change in market, he executed a few portraits and concentrated on publishing his theories on art. On Durr's death in April 6, 1528, the theologian and reformer Erasmus of Rotterdam eulogized the artist, praising his prints as they expressed and achieved using only black lines. His death at age 56 meant he did not witness the Augsburg Confession of 1513 that established the Lutheran doctrine as an official alternative to Catholicism. The first 100 years of printmaking in Europe, it was not until the 15th century that prints as we know them today were made. There were two preconditions. First, paper developed in China in the 2nd century was not widely available until 1400 in Europe. Second, there needed to be a conceptual leap to apply techniques used for adornment of exquisite vessels, weapons, and armor to metal plates, usually copper. Those plates became the matrix from which one could print images on multiple pieces of paper. This was the beginning of a new era of visual literature for the public in Europe. At the time, visual literacy was really limited to two print processes, the woodcut and the engraving. Durr's early years of his training and travel, his father taught him the fundamentals of drawing and design and the use of the burn, a steel tool with a sharp tip for engraving metal. Engraving is an intaglio process where the image is cut below the surface of the plate. The cut away image holds the ink, which when printed under pressure is pulled out of the design by the paper. One of the tricks to using a burn is keeping the cutting edge sharpened. Acknowledging Durr's desire to be a painter, his father apprenticed him to Michael Wollmach, a painter whose workshop specialized in artlepieces, book illustrations, and glass painting. It was during his apprenticeship that Wollmach received the commission from Anton Kohlberger, a successful printer, publisher, and bookseller, to provide woodcut illustrations for the Nuremberg Chronicle. The Nuremberg Chronicle was a history of the world to be printed in both Latin and German. The exposure to this project, which he may have contributed to anonymously, and having Kohlberger as his godfather, were important early experiences. Can we see the first slide, please? The Kohlberger Bible was published in 1483 by Anton Kohlberger, a formal goldsmith who set up his printing house in Nuremberg in 1470. The Bible is illustrated with 109 woodcuts. I show you here the four horsemen of the apocalypse from the book of Revelation. Note that the woodcuts are printed with the text, not as full-page images. The woodcut is a relief process, and that is the second process available to printmakers at the time. I picked this particular image for you to compare with the full-page illustration of the four horsemen of the apocalypse by Durr. This early printed Bible in German was a precursor to Luther's 1534 Bible. Printed Bibles were made possible with the invention of the movable type by Johannes Gutenberg only about 1455. Can we look at the map next? In 1489, upon completion of his 3-year apprenticeship, Durr undertook the traditional Wanderjahr or journeyman's travel several years to expand his contacts and gain experience. He is said to have spent time in Basel and Strasbourg, important publishing centers where he may have designed illustrations for books. Note the location of Colmar and Venice on this map. It's on the left center. Next, please. The most important engraver in Western Europe before Durr was Martin Schoengauer. During his wonder year, he is said to have traveled to Colmar in 1492 to meet the artist, unaware that he had died months earlier. Schoengauer was recognized for his skill at controlling cross-hatching and contour shading with the burin. His superior sense of composition and fine printing set the standard for the day. Schoengauer's engravings were pious, devotional subjects with an ornate drapery, representing the final flowering of Northern Gothic spirit. His courtly Virgin has a sweet expression and delicate facial features. She is the Virgin of Humility, seated on the ground with the Christ child in her lap. The enclosed garden was a common symbol for her purity. Note that the drapery appears rather brittle, yet it does focus the attention on the Virgin's face. At bottom center, Schoengauer signed the plate with an MS separated by a cross and a crescent. Next, please. To open a workshop in Nuremberg, one had to marry. In July 1492, upon his return from his Wanderjahr, Durr married Agnes Frey, the daughter of a prosperous Nuremberg coppersmith. A few months later, he used her dowry of 200 florins to travel south, possibly as far as Venice, which was a major artistic book and publishing center. Upon his return in spring 1495, he opened his workshop in Nuremberg. Although he created paintings, Durr focused primarily on printmaking as a means of livelihood and strove to enhance the artistic status of woodcuts and engravings as he knew them. A high percentage of his woodcuts represent sacred themes, including scenes of the Passion of Christ and images of the Virgin and Child, as well as popular saints. His engravings explored not only religious subjects, but a range of mythological and secular themes of interest to his humanist friends. This fusion of Northern and Southern traditions was coupled with Durr's interest in depicting texture and subtle tonal transitions. You are looking at the Holy Family with Three Hairs of 1497-98. It is a large, richly detailed woodcut, rivaling the size of devotional panels. It reached a broader audience because it was available in affordable multiple copies. The Virgin, about to be crowned by two putties, sits in a walled garden, a symbol of her virginity, surrounded by flowers and herbs, with three hares playing in the foreground. Joseph, with his hat removed, glazes in wonder at the Christ child. The woodcut focuses on the pattern and rhythm rather than three-dimensional space and solid form. Next, please. Just a year later, the Virgin and Child with Monkey is one of his early engravings. And compare this in the exhibition with the Virgin and Child in a courtyard. Durr's Holy Family with Three Hairs. In this engraving, he demonstrates full control of pictorial effects in handling of light, texture, and the rendering of landscape. There is a coherent depth to the background and summary reflections in the water. The Virgin's sleeve and skirt drape like actual fabric rather than appearing like crumpled paper in the skirt of Schoengauer's Virgin. There is a compositional clarity and a serenity of mood. The chained monkey signifies the power of Mary's virtue, and the bird, a light on the hand of the Christ child, alludes to voluntary submission of his soul. I should point out that printing of engravings and etchings required the development of a wooden roller press between 1460 and 65. This press was different from Gutenberg's press with movable type, requiring different viscosities of ink and flat metal plates for printing. Next, please. Samson Fighting the Lion of 1497-98 is a woodcut. Samson, an Old Testament figure with superhuman strength, is astride a lion, his right foot on the beast's neck, his bare hand prying its jaws open. Durr ventured into woodcut design beyond the simple images to be hand-colored, as in the example from the Kohlberger Bible. Designing an image and cutting a woodblock are different skills. You know how wood splinters? The block still exists in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The wood that Durr used, we know today, is a dense pear wood. Hence, it was possible to carve the fine lines which taper. It is probable that he carved the block himself to better understand the process and how it differs from engraving in metal. What happens as a block is continuously printed under pressure is that it begins to break down. And in the case of this particular subject, the tiny birds in the sky begin to disappear. Next subject, please. Durr was the earliest to introduce stories of mythology and classical sources into the German market. This engraving does not represent one of the 12 labors of Hercules. It may depict the twins Eurytus and Cetus, who overwhelmed all men in their path. He drew a copy of Andreas Mantegna's engraving of 1492. Let's look at that. Next, please. The reclining figure on the left is derived from the right half of the Battle of the Sea Gods by Mantegna. And this particular engraving is considered to be done somewhere around 1490. Look at the female figure at the left edge. She is the mirror image of the drawing, or the, Mantegna's print. And that is because of the left-right reversal of the printing process. Next, please. The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse of 1497-98. This particular impression is a proof before text. And you have that opportunity to really see a brilliant early example of a woodcut. At the close of the 15th century, European civilization was faced by earth-shattering catastrophes and immense transformation. With unprecedented vividness, Durr brings to life the terrors of the last days and biblical promise of the final New Testament book of Revelations, or the Apocalypse. In these woodcuts executed between 1496 and 98, he pushes the woodcuts to new heights with a variety of lines to convey detail, distance, light, and texture. In 1498, Durr published the Apocalypse, an illustrated book comprising a title page and 15 full-page woodcuts. This was possible because of the development of the press for movable type for the text, and of course, a different press for the printing of the blocks. The woodcut was designed to be viewed independently, not to illustrate the facing text. He simultaneously published editions in Latin and German. The Latin text is St. Jerome's Vulgate, while the German text is that of the Kohlberger Bible of 1483, shown at the beginning of your exhibition. Durr credited himself as creator and publisher on the colophon, or the end page. It says, printed at Nuremberg by Albrecht Dürer, painter, year of our Lord, 1498. He proudly placed his monogram, AD, on each woodcut. The artist was the first designer of woodcuts to do so. There was a market for religious books which tended to survive until, unlike single prints, which were used and probably used up. The Apocalypse brought Durer's worldwide fame in Europe at the end of the century. In 1511, there was so much call for the Apocalypse that he reprinted a Latin edition and simultaneously issued a large Passion and the Life of the Virgin. The most famous print in the Apocalypse is the Four Horsemen. According to St. John's prophetic vision in Revelations, each time the Lamb broke one of the four seals, a horseman was given the authority to kill by the sword, by famine, by plague. Durr compresses the four riders into a phalanx, moving in a sharp diagonal across the ominous sky, buffeted by winds that lift them off the ground, dramatically increasing the impact of the print. The lead rider, representing war, aims his bow forward to attack. The second rider aggressively wields a huge sword to take away peace from the earth and set people killing each other. The third rider spreads famine by swinging his scale. Bringing up the rear, Death harvests his victims with a pitchfork. In the bottom, a medieval hellmouth lies ready to swallow up the fallen. This impression is an early impression printed on a thinner paper with an imperial orb watermark. A watermark is the paper manufacturer's mark. The book version was printed on a thicker paper so that the text did not show through the page. This woodcut in the exhibition is what one could consider a brilliant impression. Let's look at a detail. Next, please. You will note Durr's design imposes the quality of the engraving's burn, swelling lines to the woodcut, and renders volumetric forms to create an impression of unprecedented expressive power. Remember that a woodcut is a relief process so that you cut around the lines in the block rather than engrave them into the surface of the plate. This makes cross-hatching a particular challenge because you can't cut away a wood when you cross-hatch. Look at the sleeve of the warrior with the raised left arm holding the sword. Look at the area of the horse's mane where lines crossed other hairs in the mane. These are two areas where you can really see his skill in engraving. Next, please. Simultaneously, Durr was producing large format woodcuts of the Passion, one of the most popular subjects in German art of the period. Initially, he issued the prints separately, and in 1510, after his second trip to Italy, he added a title page and more episodes for a total of 11 scenes that was published in 1511. The woodcuts spanned the Last Supper to Christ's resurrection and were accompanied by a narrative verses in Latin by Celadonus, a learned Benedictine monk who resided at the monastery of St. Giles in Nuremberg. In this woodcut, he captures the dramatic moment of a heroic anguish during the procession to Calvary as the crowd moves diagonally to the right. As Christ stumbles, the soldier turns and pulls the rope tied around Christ's waist, while another soldier pokes his pike in his neck. In the foreground is Veronica, kneeling, offering her veil, while Simon bends to assist with the weight of the cross. The composition is divided by the cross, placing Mary and John helplessly observing in the background. Next, please. This is Durr at 1500, what is basically the midpoint in his career. At that point in time, he considered himself a creative individual who achieved international recognition rather than as a mere craftsman. He frequently recorded his own likeness at a time when self-portraits by artists were uncommon. His most iconic self-portrait is an oil painting now hanging in the Alte Pinakothek in Munich. On September 2020, this painting was featured in the electronic New York Times as an example of the first selfie. The text at the right reads, "Thus I, Albrecht Dürer of Nuremberg, painted myself with indelible colors at the age of 28. At the left appears his monogram AD under 1500. By particular coincidence, AD also stands for Anno Domini, Year of the Lord. His frontal pose and direct gaze were unconventional for secular portraits. With long curled hair and beard, he cultivated a Christ-like appearance. Next, please. The expansion of Durr's workshop and his deeper engagement in Italian art. The period after 1500 was a time of growth of his workshop and greater technical sophistication and a wider spectrum of subject matter. Around 1500, three young artists, Hans Baldung, Hans von Kolbach, and Hans Schofferlein, joined Durr's workshop and helped him produce illustrations for devotional books and designs, stained glass, and paintings. This is his Saint Eustace of 1501. It is an engraving. It tells the golden legend story of Palladius, a pagan Roman military commander who, while out hunting, experiences the vision of a stag, a cross with the crucified Christ between its antlers. Stunned, Placidus fell from his horse and converted to Christianity, taking the name Eustace, meaning the steadfast. During the 15th century, Eustace was a saint popular with hunters. This is the largest of Durr's engravings and rivals the size of paintings. And not only that, but the execution of details of nature and texture. It set a new standard for gradations of tonal values and the depiction of individual elements. Durr presents Eustace on his knees, along with his mount, his dogs, and the distant stag seen in profile. It emphasizes the visionary moment by inserting a stand of trees between Eustace and the stag. The figures still lack the successful integration into the landscape, which Durr achieves in Adam and Eve. And let's take a look at Adam and Eve. Next, please. This is one of the most famous depictions of the fallen man in the history of art. In fact, you can buy reproductions off the internet. By 1500, Durr practiced a theological, mathematical canon of ideal human proportions that reflected his exposure to Italian Renaissance art and the interest of his humanist friends. The nudes embodying masculine and feminine perfection are silhouetted in paradise against a wooded background before the fall. They resemble ancient statues of Apollo and Venus. Adam and Eve stand in complementary contrapposto poses, meaning the weight of their body is primarily on one leg. The animals, elk, ox, rabbit, and cat, represent the four temperaments or the humors: melancholy, phlegm, sanguinity, and choler, thought to keep the human disposition in balance. After the couples fall, the balance gives way to one humor, melancholy. Note the goat on the cliff in the upper right. It foretells the sin that will burden humankind. There is also immediately below in pen and ink, W.E. This engraving was a proud possession of William Easdale. Collectors over the ages have added a stamp or a mark to a brilliant impression that they were proud to own. Now let's take a look at the evolution of this print. Next, please. You will note in the second state, which is in the Albertina collection, that Durr started with the background and moved to the legs of Adam. You will also notice that there is a plaque hanging on the tree above Adam. The artist signed the work in Latin with his full name stating Albrecht Dürer of Nuremberg made this. This is the only time he signed his full name, and you'll have to go back to take time to look at the original fully completed print. Next, please. For almost 30 years, Durr studied proportion. His manuscript on proportion was complete at the time of his death. In 1528, his wife Agnes published the manuscript posthumously. Durr dedicated the work to his friend, the humanicist William Pickheimer. Over the course of Durr's career, his ideas on proportion did change. He went from believing that a single ideal type could be derived from a mathematical construction to realizing that there was no single canon of beauty. He assembled alternative sets of proportions from different body types and heights. The book uses schematic figures in more than one view and were intended to show the results of his research. We have a copy of the book at the close of the exhibition, and you'll be able to examine one example of the proportional representation of a woman. Next, please. Employing a range of architectural and landscape settings, Durr presented the small horse in a barrel vault, demonstrating his understanding of Italian Renaissance principles of one-point perspective. Durr likewise had an intense interest in perfect equine proportions, an interest he explored in his earlier St. Eustace. In both instances, the horse is presented in profile with its right leg raised. While in Venice, he probably studied Italian equestrian monuments. Durr intended to write about the proportions of the horse in his treatise on painting, but the notes were stolen, perhaps by his pupil Theobald Boehme, who published his own treatise on proportions in 1528. And we have that open in another book at the end of the exhibition, so you'll want to take a look at that closely. Next, please. Employing a range of architectural and landscape settings, Durr presents the Virgin's life, innovating with domestic intimacy and naturalism. He further demonstrates his understanding of Italian Renaissance one-point perspective. The series comprises a title page and 19 plates depicting Virgin's major life events, beginning with her conception and ending with her death and glorification. 17 plates were completed between 1503 and 1505 and sold separately prior to his trip to Italy between 1505 and 1507. He completed the set upon his return from Venice and published it in 1511, along with the large Passion, the Smalls Passion, and the reissue of the Latin edition of the Apocalypse. The following year, he completed the engraved Passion. Again, for this Life of the Virgin, Durr commissioned Benedict Caledonius to provide Latin verses explaining the images in the Life of the Virgin. Durr's ended the Life of the Virgin with a colophon warning about the dire consequences of copying his work. The artist thought of his invention and monogram in legal terms, anticipating the modern concept of copyright. The set in the exhibition is a proof set before text on the verso. Thus is it printed on a thinner paper, and the printing in black ink is consistent throughout the set. Let's take a moment to consider who the market was for Durr's prints. The books with Latin text were designed to appeal to humanists, wealthy merchants, and clergy. We can only glean from his diaries the relative value he put on his prints. He sold, traded, and gifted his prints. He did hire at one point in time a traveling salesman to distribute his prints, and probably took advantage of his godfather's trade book for his books. His wife and mother sold them at fairs, religious festivals, and markets. Basically, he considered woodcuts as less valuable than engravings, and the size of the sheet of paper factored into the cost to the purchaser. In the Patrol of the Virgin you've seen here, note that the woman standing behind the Virgin. In 1500, he executed a watercolor, Nuremberg woman dressed for church. He has adapted the flow of the fabric and the woman's bonnet to the medium of woodcut so that it appears supple as in the original watercolor. Next, please. We take a step back and look at an engraving by Martin Schoengauer, The Flight into Egypt of 1470-75. I show you this print to compare with Durr's interpretation of The Flight into Egypt. Durr borrowed the date palms, the drachnia plants, lizards, and stag from Schoengauer's engraving. Let's take a look at Durr's version. Durr adjusts the proportion of Mary to those of the donkey, the size of the figures to the more naturalistic landscape, and conveys ongoing movement. Next, please. Durr was interested in fame and fortune. He regretted the time he spent on painting commissions because they were not as lucrative. His engraving skills reached new heights in 1513 and 14. Night, Death, and the Devil, St. Jerome and his study, and Melancholy I have since the 19th century been known by scholars and collectors as his master prints. Nearly identical in size, they are remarkable for their iconographic complexity and technical virtuosity. Gray and silver midtones appear in his graphic compositions, achieved by hatching, and hatching is a way of shading with close parallel lines. Since the late 18th century, this engraving has been referred to as Night, Death, and the Devil. Durr himself referred to it simply as Reuter or Rider in his Netherlandish diary. The main figure is a Christian knight, likely inspired by Erasmus' Handbook of the Christian Soldier, first published in 1501. The knight, accompanied by his faithful dog, moves fearlessly forward, despite the distraction of death, holding an hourglass, symbol of the brevity of life. Death is portrayed as a decaying corpse, his head surrounded by snakes. He rides a decrepit nag whose sagging head directs attention to a skull resting on the stump near the cartellino, or a small piece of paper, that bears the artist's monogram. Lurking behind Death is a grotesque horned beast with a pike, representing the devil. A wreath of oak leaves on the horse's mane and tail allude to the knight's successful return from the hunt. Durr's study of ideal horse proportion culminates in this engraving, suggesting again that he did study bronze equestrian moderates which he would have known in Italy. The compressed rocky landscape, the wealth of detail, the subtle textural variety, and multiple diagonals reinforce the steady advance of the heroic knight. The second of his master prints is St. Jerome in his study of 1514. Can we have that, please? One of the four Latin fathers of the Roman Catholic Church, St. Jerome is portrayed as a contemplative scholar writing in a humble and orderly interior. The writer arrives at the scene via steps in the foreground, beyond which the dozing lion, the saint's attribute, and a dog representing fidelity protect the privacy of the study. While one-point perspective structures the space, sunlight bathes the room with natural light, which reflects off interior surfaces and subtly differentiates textures from the wood grain ceiling and the lion's fur. The gourd hanging on the ceiling alludes to Jerome's disagreement with Augustine over the translation of the Hebrew word klakayon in the Bible, which should it be translated as ivy or as gourd. Additional objects associated with St. Jerome include the hourglass on the back wall, adjacent to the cardinal's hat, and the skull on the windowsill, both alluding to human mortality. Next, please. The third of the master prints is Melancholy I of 1514. Renaissance humanicists associated the melancholy, a state of deep sadness and gloom, with creativity and genius. In this engraving, Durr personalizes melancholy as an enormous, brooding, winged figure resting her head on one hand. Her inertia and distant gaze, as well as the disorderly state of her environs, stand in contrast to St. Jerome in his study. Melancholy is weighed down by her inability to fully acquire earthly knowledge using the tools and instruments of scientific and creative endeavor that surround her. In the second state of the print, which is shown here, there is a Jupiter square, a table of numbers. The artist has corrected the number 9 so that each line up, down, and in diagonal add up to 34. This puzzle was thought to attract the healing influence of Jupiter to counteract the negative influence of Saturn on a melancholic personality. Another symbolic object associated with melancholy is the wreath of lovage, utilized to relieve the symptoms of disease, while the hourglass and mourning bell are reminders of death. Throughout the image, Durr has successfully combined varying patterns of flex and hatching to achieve the subtle range of tones. Next, please. The actual development of etching is just beginning, and Landscape with a Cannon is the 6th and final experimental etching that Durr made on iron. This is an early impression before rust spots appear on the plate and thus on the print. The lines are blunt and thick and do not reflect the finesse of Durr's engraved lines, nor their range of tonal values. Nuremberg was known for its metal foundries, and the city coat of arms appears on the toolbox of the cannon barrel. The cannon on a high cliff above an expansive landscape has no apparent target. There are, however, 3 German soldiers appearing to guard the cannon because of the presence of foreigners, including men dressed in Turkish costume. In 1518, Durr was part of a Nuremberg delegation to the Imperial Diet in Augsburg to help mobilize the German states for war against the Turks. Perhaps the contemporary Turkish threat to the eastern borders of the empire influenced the choice of subject. 3/4 of the composition is devoted to pure etched landscape. It set a precedent for the subsequent generation of Daniel-style landscape artists such as Augustin Hirschvogel, whose landscape with a bridge and square tower to the right can be seen in the final gallery of the exhibition. Next, please. The Reformation was a pan-European event, not limited to Germany. Martin Luther, known, however, an Augustine monk and theologian at the University of Wittenberg, was the most popular reformer. In October of 1517, Luther challenged the hierarchy of his own Roman Catholic faith by posting the 59 Theses condemning the sale of indulgence. Durr took an intense interest in Luther's ideas and by 1520 owned a number of his pamphlets. He never left Catholicism and never publicly criticized the papacy. Lutheranism and other Protestant beliefs spread through Northern Europe. Durr's own home city, Nuremberg, officially adopted Lutheranism in 1525. As a result, Durr's market for his New Testament subjects, his images of saints, and numerous interpretations of the German child declined significantly in Protestant areas. In his final years, Durr complained of losing his eyesight and having less dexterity in his hands. Doing an engraving is quite a manual labor. He made printed portraits of powerful men, including Erasmus, and concentrated his attention on publishing 3 books about his theories: Instructions on Measurements in 1525, a treatise on fortification in 1527, and 4 books on human proportion, published posthumously by his wife in 1528. His portrait of William Peckheimer in 1524 represents one of his closest friends and the leading humanicist in Nuremberg. Peckheimer was an important influence on Durr's career. Prior to meeting Durr, Peckheimer had studied law in Italy at universities in Padua and Pavia. His passion for the classics led him to assemble one of the finest libraries of the period, which Durr had access to. He introduced Durr to his humanist society in Nuremberg and advised him on classical and literary themes for his prints. The translation on the inscription on the tablet reads, "The portrait of Wilhelm Pirkheimer at the age of 53. We live by the spirit, the rest belongs to death." Durr hoped to do a portrait of Martin Luther, but the opportunity never occurred. Next, please. Now, I share with you two works that are not in the exhibition, but are really important in telling the full story of Durr's life. This is the Triumphal Arch of Maximilian of 1515. It is 192 woodcuts on 42 sheets of paper with 2 etchings. The Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I, who reigned from 1493 to 1519, became Durr's patron in 1512. He sponsored woodcut ensembles with political messages of his power as emperor. Among the projects that Durr worked on for the emperor was the Triumphal Arch of Maximilian, which was completed in 1515, and the Triumphal Procession, never completed. So Durr took back his 8 blocks, which included the Triumphal Chariot with Maximilian, and separately published them after Maximilian's death. The program was devised by the emperor. The work required intensive collaboration with other artists. Durr's principal roles were making designs and supervising his own workshop production. For 3 years, he was not paid, and he finally was able to get a pension drawn from the taxes to be paid by the city of Nuremberg. This particular copy that I'm showing you is the Triumphal Arch, belongs to the National Gallery of Arts and can be examined on their workshop in detail. Next, please. This is a portrait of Emperor Maximilian circa 1519. It is one of 4 versions of the portrait. The woodcut is based on a charcoal drawing Durr executed at the August Diet in June 28, 1518. Unlike the allegories that dominate the Triumphal Arch and the Triumphal Chariot, the likeness is striking yet plain and restrained and lacking the customary accessories of crown, orb, and scepter. Maximilian does wear the chain of the Bulgarian Order of the Golden Fleece, which as sovereign he presided over. Next, please. This is a portrait of Maximilian done after Durr's woodcut by Lucas van Leyden, about 1520. With the sudden death of Durr's patron, Emperor Maximilian, in January of 1519, the city council of Nuremberg refused to continue paying the annuity from their taxes. Durr traveled to Aachen, the location of the coronation of Charles V, the successor of Maximilian, as the Holy Roman Emperor, to ensure the extension of his imperial annuity. In his diary, Durr recounts his historic meeting with Lucas van Leyden, his younger contemporary and competitor, in Antwerp in June 1521. Van Leyden exchanged his complete graphic ove for 8 guilders worth of Durr's prints. This trade probably included Leyden's posthumous portrait of Emperor Maximilian I after Durr's own woodcut. Borrowing a detail from another artist's work was an acceptable practice at the time and an opportunity for van Leyden to capitalize on the popularity of memorial portraits of the Holy Roman Emperor, as did Durr with his portrait. Van Leyden's portrait of Maximilian I is considered a landmark in the history of etching. It is the first etching on copper rather than iron, and Durr, of course, dropped printing with iron, etching with iron, because it did not really satisfy him. This print is the first to combine etching and engraving in a single print. Van Leyden drops Durr's iconic image by eliminating the honorific titles and by placing the bust-length portrait in an architectural setting. Van van Leyden's portrait is youthful, contemplative, and humane, unlike Durr's. Today, the work of Albrecht Dürer is still revered. It made the New York Times in September. You can buy reproductions on the internet. Although there have been volumes written about Durr today, there's a new generation of scholars who are taking fresh look at the artist and his work. We at the Cincinnati Art Museum are pleased to share our originals from our collection with the Frist Art Museum.
Thank you so much, Kristin. I see we've got a few questions here. Let's see. Joanne asks, why did Durr choose to focus on producing works on spec rather than relying on commissions?
Well, the paintings that he did took a long time because you're using oil, so they don't dry instantly like a watercolor or acrylic paint that we use today. And secondly, although he maybe didn't print large editions initially of his prints, the blocks and plates were kept around the workshop and could be reprinted later. And you notice that in 1511, he does a major sort of rush of printing his books and probably individual plates at the same time. So I don't know if that answers your question, but his contemporaries, we don't have that many impressions of his work, and yet today you can go to an old master print auction and still find impressions of Durer's prints. So, I mean, the number of his prints that were printed probably after 1500 were quite numerous.
How long would it take to make a woodcut or engraving plate, Suzanne asks?
Well, it would take me forever. I don't really know. You have, I think, several artists who are going to be giving demonstrations or have done a video. They have firsthand experience, whereas I have never done an engraving. I can tell you that engraving on metal, you have to constantly sharpen your burin to cut the metal. And secondly, you have to use a lot of pressure. And that's probably why in his later years, he was saying that, he was feeling weaker. With a woodcut, today you could probably go and do a linoleum cut quite fast. But again, to do the kinds of woodcuts that he did, he was using a very hard wood. So again, and also if you slip in either on a metal plate or a woodcut block, you're not going to be able to make a correction. So you're going to want to take a little time and be careful.
Some of the details in these are just astounding to me. So I'm sure a lot of care went into planning and carving the wood blocks or engraving the plates. We have a few questions about the edition size of Durer's prints. I know you said earlier that there are still copies available today on markets, and that many were made after his death, presumably. But do you have any idea about the edition size?
Today, you can't judge the edition of his prints by today's standards, where the artist does 250 impressions and puts a number on it. That's really a marketing ploy that was developed in the late 19th century to sort of up the prices of prints. I've talked to people who specialize in 15th century, and of course, one of the things that you have to remember is that a single print would be used and then would be used up. The books have a better chance of sort of surviving. And probably Durr, paper cost money. So, he's going to probably print a small edition. It's certainly that is borne out by, the survival of works by his contemporaries. But as the demand grew, and probably after 1500, then he would continue to print. The way he seemed to price his prints was on, certainly paper size was a factor. And of course, the blocks and plates probably sat around in the workshop and could be, reprinted as demand really required.
And you mentioned earlier that one of the blocks is still in existence, and I think we've got an image of it in our exhibition. Sherry asks, can you see any of Durr's wood blocks to this day?
Well, I know that there's the one at the Met, but they don't have it on exhibition all the time. You would have to make an appointment with their print and drawing department. I have seen it, and one of the things about a block is that it gets reprinted again and again, but it's still in fair condition.
I think we have time for one more question. Tiffy asks why Durr had to marry to open a workshop.
That was apparently the requirement of the city of Nuremberg. You could not have a business without being married.
All right.
Thank heavens we don't have that today.
Right. we've come a long way. Well, thank you so much, Kristin, and thank you to the Cincinnati Art Museum for sharing these exquisite prints with us. A few of you have asked if this recording will be available, and we will share it on our website, fristartmuseum.org. So you're welcome to watch it again or share it with others there. And we would love for you to come see the exhibition in person. Albrecht Dürer, The Age of Reformation and Renaissance, is open at the Frist Art Museum, and you can reserve your timed tickets to see the exhibition at fristartmuseum.org. We hope to see you in person soon or virtually at our next program. You can find out more about our upcoming virtual programs by visiting our website, following us on social media, or by signing up for our weekly email newsletter. As you leave the Zoom tonight, you'll be invited to take a brief survey. A link to the survey will appear in your browser. Your feedback is important to us and will help us improve future programs. And finally, we're so thankful for your support of the Frist Art Museum. Financial gifts during this time allow us to bring you great programming like tonight's lecture. Support of any amount is greatly appreciated. Please consider making a donation at fristartmuseum.org. Thank you all again. I hope you have a great evening. Bye.